It started like a normal day. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Just another quiet afternoon inside a home where everything, at least on the surface, seemed fine. A young boy was there, safe. At least, that's what everyone believed. But by the end of that day, everything would change. And what followed would become one of the most disturbing and confusing cases in recent years. Because this wasn't just about what happened. It was about what was said and what didn't make sense. Before we go any further, I want you to pay attention to one thing throughout this story. Every time something doesn't add up, notice it. Because in this case, the truth wasn't hidden. It was buried under too many different versions. At the center of this story is an 11-year-old boy, Gannon Stauch, described as kind, energetic, and loved deeply by his family. And then there was the woman responsible for caring for him at the time, Letecia Stauch, his stepmother, someone trusted, someone inside the home. And that's what makes this case uncomfortable. Because sometimes the danger isn't outside. On January 27, 2020, Gannon was reported missing. According to Letecia, he had left the house. She said he went out. She said he didn't come back. At first, it sounded like a typical missing person situation. A child leaves, something goes wrong, and now everyone is trying to find him. But almost immediately, something fell off. Her story didn't feel solid. It wasn't clear. And more importantly, it started changing. At one point, she suggested one version of events, then another, then something slightly different. And this is where I want you to start paying attention. Because when someone tells the truth, details may fade, but the core story stays the same. Here, that didn't happen. Think about this. A child is missing. Time is critical. Every minute matters. So why does the story around his disappearance keep shifting? Why are there inconsistencies? And why does it feel like something is being held back? As the search for Gannon intensified, the public started paying attention. People weren't just focused on finding him anymore. They were also watching her, listening closely, analyzing every statement. Because something didn't sit right, Letecia spoke publicly. She gave interviews. She tried to explain what happened. But instead of clearing things up, it created more confusion. Her tone, her explanations, her reactions. People began to question everything. And this is where the case starts to shift. It stops being just a missing person case and starts becoming something else entirely. The timeline. Timelines are critical in investigations. They help establish what happened and when. But in this case, the timeline wasn't clear. There were gaps, unexplained moments, and inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. Let's slow this down. A boy goes missing. The last person to see him gives multiple versions of events. The timeline doesn't line up, and the public starts to notice. So now the question becomes, is this confusion or something else? At this point in the story, I want to ask you, do you think this is just panic and stress? Or do you think something deeper is going on? Because what comes next changes everything. Investigators weren't ignoring the inconsistencies. They were watching, listening, piecing things together. Because when a story keeps changing, it usually means one thing. Something isn't right. And here's where it gets more intense. As days passed, there were still no answers. No confirmed sightings. No clear direction. Just questions. And one person at the center of all of it. A missing child. A story that keeps changing. A timeline that doesn't add up. And a growing feeling that this wasn't what it seemed. Because sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once. It comes out piece by piece. If you're following this so far, make sure you stay to the end. Because the next part of this story is where things take a much darker turn. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. At this point, something had clearly shifted. This was no longer just a search for a missing child. It was becoming an investigation filled with doubt, confusion, and growing suspicion. Because the more Letecia Stauch spoke, the less things made sense. Let's go back to what she initially said. That Gannon left the house and never came back. Simple, straightforward. But then, that version started to change. At one point, she suggested he had gone somewhere else. At another, she implied something different entirely. And each time she spoke, there was a slight shift, a new detail, a new explanation. Now think about that for a second. When someone is telling the truth, they may forget small details, but the main story, it doesn't keep evolving. So why was hers? Pause here for a second. If you were watching this unfold in real time, at what point would you start to feel like something isn't right? Because for many people, that moment had already come. As her interviews circulated, people began analyzing everything, not just what she said, but how she said it, her tone, her body language, her choice of words. And the reaction? It wasn't sympathy. It was suspicion, because something felt off. Behind the scenes, investigators were doing what they do best. They weren't just listening. They were verifying, checking timelines, reviewing movements, looking for anything that didn't align. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Remember how we talked about the timeline? This is where it becomes critical, because there were gaps, moments that couldn't be clearly explained. And in a case like this, those gaps matter a lot, because every missing minute is an opportunity for something to happen. Investigators began looking closely at movements that day, where she went, what she did, how long she was gone, and whether those actions matched her story. Because if they didn't, then that changes everything. Things weren't lining up. What was being said didn't fully match what was being observed. And when that happens in an investigation, it raises one major question. Why? Let's think about this clearly. A child disappears. The last person to see him gives inconsistent accounts. Timelines don't match. Movements raise questions. At what point does this stop being coincidence and start becoming something else? As days passed, the pressure intensified. Search efforts continued. The public demand for answers grew louder. And the focus? It kept coming back to one person, Letecia Stauch. Because no matter how many directions the case seemed to go, everything led back to her. This is where the case takes a serious turn. It's no longer just, where is Gannon? It becomes, what actually happened inside that house? And that question changes everything. Let me ask you something here. Do you think investigators already knew what happened and were just building the case? Or were they still trying to figure it out piece by piece? Because what comes next suggests they were getting closer to something big. Every investigation has a moment, that point where things start to come together, where small inconsistencies turn into something more serious. And this case was reaching that moment, because now it wasn't just about what she said. It was about what the evidence was beginning to show. A missing child, a story that keeps changing, a timeline that doesn't fit, movements that raise questions, and investigators quietly putting it all together, because the truth was getting closer. And when it finally started to come out, it would change everything. Stay with me, because in the next part, we get into the evidence. And this is where the case becomes even more disturbing. The kind of details that make you question everything you thought you understood. And trust me, you're not going to see it coming. At this point, the investigation had reached a turning point. This was no longer about speculation, no longer about inconsistencies alone. Now, it was about evidence. And once that began to surface, everything changed. Up until now, much of the case revolved around what was being said. But investigators weren't relying on words. They were gathering something far more powerful, facts. Because unlike stories, facts don't change. Behind the scenes, investigators were carefully piecing things together, looking at movements, examining locations, reconstructing what likely happened, step by step. And slowly, a clearer picture began to form. But it wasn't the kind of picture anyone wanted to see. Let me ask you this. When someone's story keeps changing, do you trust what they say? Or do you wait for the evidence to speak? Because in this case, the evidence spoke loudly. At some point, the investigation crossed a line. From, something isn't adding up, to, something serious happened here. And once that line is crossed, everything shifts. Because now, it's not about finding someone who is missing. It's about understanding what was done. Think about everything we've seen so far. A child disappears. The last person with him gives conflicting stories. The timeline doesn't match. Movements raise suspicion. Now, add one more piece. Evidence that doesn't support the story being told. That's when the situation becomes impossible to ignore. Investigators were no longer treating this as a simple disappearance. They were now looking at it through a different lens, a much darker one. As more information began to surface, the public reaction shifted as well. People who were once hopeful now felt something else entirely: concern, shock, suspicion. Because the more details that came out, the harder it became to believe the earlier explanations. From the very beginning, the story kept changing. And now, with evidence coming into play, those changes mattered more than ever. Because inconsistencies don't just confuse a situation, they expose it. At this point, do you think the truth was always there, just hidden under different versions of the story? Or do you think it only started to come out when the pressure increased? Because either way, the outcome was the same. Everything was pointing in one direction, all leading to a conclusion that no one wanted to accept at first. But once it became clear, there was no going back. This is the part that changes everything. Because at the center of all of this was a child who was supposed to be safe, protected, cared for, and instead became the center of a case filled with confusion, contradictions, and ultimately a devastating outcome. Cases like this are difficult because sometimes the truth isn't hidden far away. It's just buried under layers of doubt. What initially appeared to be a missing persons case was something far more serious. Authorities determined that Gannon Stauch had been killed, and the person responsible was the one who had been at the center of the story all along. Letecia Stauch. She was arrested, charged, and as the case moved through the court system, more details came to light, details that confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. In the end, she was found guilty and convicted for the murder of Gannon, a child who should have been safe, lost his life, and a case that started with confusion and changing stories ended with a truth that was far more devastating than anyone expected. So now I want to leave you with this. At what point did you realize something wasn't right? Was it the changing stories, the timeline, or something else entirely? Because in cases like this, everyone sees it differently. If you found this case as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Journals, because we break down real cases like this. And before you go, leave your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next case.
Letecia Stauch, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Today, that's all reversed with a ruling from the Colorado Court of Appeal.